So I've come to this point in my life where I identify mostly as a social scientist, but I trained in computer science. I was a kid during the rise of the internet in the 90s, where everyone was excited about how the internet puts a printing press in everybody's hands. Citizens can engage and publish their opinions online. Governments can be more in touch with their citizens. And studying computer science as an undergrad, I went in with these heady promises, but a lot of the jobs are actually figuring out how to make money off of the data people publish, figuring out how to make a company that a venture capitalist will want to invest in, or a company that'll be bought by a larger tech company. So that disjuncture between the promises that were being made about what having the tools of technology in your own hands in the 90s were, and the realities I experienced working at places like Google, studying computer science in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, really motivates a lot of the questions that I ask now about not only what are the effects of technologies on people, on our society when they actually hit the ground, but also what are the implications of being in a culture where technologists are really celebrated, where students are encouraged to become science, technology, engineering, and math majors because that's assumed to be where social progress is going to come from building the better gadget, from building the green technology that's going to save the earth. And how much of the kind of social, ethical, and political thinking is there really room for in those disciplines the way they're formed now? And how can we make more room for that thinking? How can we actually appreciate what liberal arts majors and social science majors also contribute through the really important things they learn as students that you wouldn't pick up in an engineering class? So my work is really focused on the cultural politics of high technology work. So when you have a company like Google, which I used to work at, which talks about how great ideas can come from anywhere, they encourage their employees to take some of their time at work to develop new product ideas. They say that everybody has something that's creative in them. How are the rewards of that creativity really distributed within organizations like Google? What kinds of creativity and innovation are recognizable to the people who are in positions of power? And how does that then shape the kinds of innovations that we see making their way into our everyday lives? So I came to these questions because of the work experiences I'd had at places like Google and in computer science, but I'm now seeing that as new forms of wealth are building up these philanthropies like Google.org, Gates Foundation, the methods of building technologies and innovations that are coming out of the tech sector are now being rolled out in development projects, in philanthropy. Even everyday people are told, hey, you're a startup of you, and you need to understand the methods of marketing and developing vision statements for startups to figure out your own life. So understanding the cultural politics of high-tech work is, to me, also a way of getting traction on the way high-tech work norms are being promoted both in other spheres of public life and for everyday people. So a lot of human-computer interaction literature, which is what I was trained in for a lot of grad school, focuses on how to make technologies fit better in people's everyday lives, how to fit with people's psychologies, how to fit in their workplace practices, the way they share information. But one of the things that human-computer interaction has tended not to look at is the cultural ideas about how people are and how they relate to each other that technologists, computer scientists, designers kind of bring in as common sense knowledge into the technologies that they design. So there's a book, Divining a Digital Future, by Paul Durish, who's a informaticist at University of California at Irvine, and Genevieve Bell, an anthropologist at Intel, who helps semiconductor companies figure out how their chips fit with culture. And their book is looking at how the field of ubiquitous computing has sort of promised that this future is right around the corner where computers are going to fit into our walls, into our cameras, into our dishwashers, into our everyday lives. But they do it in this way that's always pointing 10 years in the future. And so they're always saying, oh, there's going to be this smart fridge and it's going to help mom cook better. Or there's going to be this way of giving medication to our elderly grandparents. And it's going to remind your grandma to always take her pills on time. They take a kind of cultural idea about how domestic life is supposed to work when everything goes well, and then they make a technology that'll help that domestic life be more efficient. And Duerksen and Bell are saying, hey, one, these technologists are taking way oversimplified images of domestic life as a basis for technology design. Real families, argue grandma doesn't want to be surveilled by her kids. She actually wants her kids to come and visit. But maybe mobility around jobs in a really fluctuating economy is actually making those kinds of family relations hard to achieve. So Duerksen and Bell are saying, hey, you're taking a way too simple image of domestic life and importing that into technology. And two, there are computers already embedded in our cars and a lot of our devices. And people are also taking Wi-Fi and taking their phones and sharing music with it and doing, software copying, music copying, some would call it privacy. So we need to actually look at the things people are really doing, not just the things that Xerox PARC or Intel thinks would be profitable to sell as a packaged product that makes everyone comfortable. So I think that work is really important because it puts the focus on the technologists themselves, and it makes the point that technologists are cultural producers, just like musicians, just like artists, but unlike those other kinds of cultural producers, are often not learning about culture and learning how to think about their own biases coming into that. So a second book that's been really influential for me is a book called Human-Machine Reconfigurations by Lucy Suchman. And Lucy Suchman was a scientist and an anthropologist who worked at Xerox PARC in the early days of trying to figure out how to make copy machines that had computers in them really easy to use. And over the last 10 years, she's been trying to figure out how do we talk about the relationships that people have with technology without assuming that humans are like this and technology is like this and the two don't fit together. Because there is some kind of technology activism that says, humans will either be liberated by machines because machines let them communicate, or humans can only be alienated by machines because machines don't have the flexibility and creativity and emotional authenticity that computers have. Suchman's saying, no, we live with machines all the time. The things we do in culture are always being shaped by our relationships to machines, our relationships to our phones, our relationships that are mediated through Facebook, which has algorithms to help put certain stories up in our news feed and push other stories down. So how do we talk about that without relying on these really static definitions of what humans are actually like all the time and what machines are always like all the time? So I think in a lot of ways she's trying to get at what designers are really excited about, which is the potential of technology to change people's lives. But she draws a lot on feminist theory because feminists outside of computers have been trying to figure out how do we get to social progress, what kinds of collaborative relationships do we need to do that, how does economics shape that, how does race shape that, how do people's different positions being from different countries, different positions in a global economy, formerly colonized people, how do those shape those collaborations? And so feminist theory gives Suchman a way of talking about how kind of power relationships like that shape the kinds of technologies that designers build and maybe give technologists and designers blind spots. So in that way, it's really complementary to Duerksen and Bell. So two studies that I've been really enjoying teaching to students, and students seem to be really turned on by as well because it relates to their lives, are Venture Labor by Gina Neff, which is a book that's about the dot-com boom and bust in the 1990s in New York, and what happened when employees for startups started to think of themselves as entrepreneurs and started to think of themselves as risk takers who had cool jobs in hot economies, and then what happened when that market fell apart, who took the blame. And then the second book that I love teaching with that is Alice Marwick's Status Update, which just came out. And Marwick is looking at how Silicon Valley cultures in the time of Facebook, coming up, Google coming up, social media basically growing as something that was pervasive in our daily lives. How do the values of social media, of self-branding, shape the way technologists and designers and marketing entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley understand themselves? And then how does basically social media branding, like branding oneself as a worker, become a second job on top of doing the technology production work that you're already supposed to be doing? This is a very interesting one. So one of the things that internet industries are known for, and Alice Morwick talks about this, Gina Neff talks about this, is the way workers start to think of themselves as risk takers, as creatives, not just people doing work on teams that contribute to some larger goal, but workers that actually have to be teaching themselves new skills all the time to keep up with the changing and with the change of speed of technology. As workers who might expect to work for a company for 2 years instead of 10 years or instead of 20 years, and so they can't expect a pension, and they're always trying to build up social networks to figure out what their next job might be. And that's one thing that the internet industries are sort of known for. But one of the things that's really interesting to me is the way that that model of being flexible, of being always networking, of always thinking out what your next idea is going to be, is actually being promoted as a model for everyday people not in the internet industries because of the economic crisis, because of the way what Wall Street was doing created so much volatility that jobs are going overseas, companies are closing, people can't get access to loans they need for small businesses. So all of a sudden, everyone needs to be super flexible. Everyone needs to be thinking about where their next job and where their next paycheck is coming from. And we see that in books like Startup of You. But at the same time, the thing the internet industries are known for was emblematic of a time in the 90s where companies were trying to figure out what the internet is, what kind of media is the internet, and how do you make money off of it. And that's one of the reasons why there was so much volatility. But now the internet is somewhat dominated by companies like Facebook and Google that have huge market share, that Facebook in particular is very hard to dislodge because building up the social network that everyone signs up to get access to on Facebook is actually really hard. It takes a lot of time. It's really hard for a competitor to come in there. So I think that students who are interested in the internet industries maybe will also be needing to take lessons from the history of monopoly capitalism to think about tactics for navigating the internet industries as they go out into the workforce. And this is something I think even researchers haven't really written a lot about. So we need to be paying attention to old economies and new economies because the world the students are going to go into is going to be a different world than the one we're researching today and the one that we can teach about today and the one that students are interning in today. This is a question that we've been talking a lot about in my classes this quarter because unpaid labor is really common now. Unpaid internships are really common. Honestly, coming from the tech industries, unpaid internships were really uncommon in that industry. I think they may still be uncommon for students who are trained in engineering. So take this advice with a grain of salt. And of course, you should always be asking people with lots of different kinds of experiences for advice. One of the things that I tell my students is if you're going to be in an unpaid internship, one, know that that's not necessarily legal, to be honest. I mean, you may decide to do it, you may decide you want the job experience, and you may not decide to raise it as a legal issue, but just know that you have the right to be looking for ways to turn that unpaid work into a paid engagement. Two, and perhaps less confrontationally, unpaid internships are okay when they're an educational experience. So if you're in an unpaid internship experience and you are doing the kind of work that they really could be paying someone to do full-time, you could turn it into an educational experience by asking for informational interviews. Ask to shadow people at different levels of the organization. Ask people to give you opportunities to practice different kinds of roles within the organization other than the one they might have brought you in to do. They might have brought you in to run the Twitter feed for this organization, but shadow the person who's a high-level marketing person, shadow the person who's a project manager. Learn how those jobs work so that when you go out into the job market, you can have more familiarity about how to explain the experiences that you've had through education and through your extracurriculars and how they might actually fulfill the needs of that role. You can kind of take something that someone might be using as a way to get low-cost or unpaid work and turn it into an opportunity to learn something that's going to help you later on. You might also think about the informational interviews as a way to build up connections. And people who you work with at this company may move to other companies, and by the time you're out of school, you can expand the network of people you can ask for support in getting a job in the variety of places they might have gone to. So I was trained in computer science and in design, and I was always very motivated by being able to poke at the world and see if I can be part of making it, a different kind of place, a better kind of place. And I think students today get the message that people who are coming out of engineering are always working on making the world a better place. And students who are coming out of other disciplines aren't necessarily learning the skills of making or tinkering, but you are when you're working in extracurriculars, when you are working in your community organizations, when you're undertaking activism to try to improve your conditions as students. You need to be thinking about culture, you need to be thinking about power, you need to be thinking about how that shapes the relationships that you have with people. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise, and if you go into organizations where they're looking for people who can look at a complicated situation and figure out how to make it work, you can tell a story about the things that you did during these 4 years that can help that person imagine how the skills that you've learned here fit into that workplace. But that's not something any professor can give you in a classroom in a direct feed. I can't tell you, hey, when you go to that job interview, tell them this, tell them that. These are how the skills you get in this classroom are going to shape it. Because jobs are different from organization to organization. Jobs are going to be different in 5 years. But if you learn how to listen, if you learn how to think critically, if you learn how to think historically about what this organization is trying to do and what they need from their employees or their activists or their citizen informants to get things done, you can make the persuasive argument in that moment where you're exploring the partnership or you're exploring the collaboration.